Hey everyone, I'm Alex, and today on Big Al Books, I wanted to make an update video about whether I actually read the books that I said that I was going to read in my 2018 TBR. So it is now almost the end of the year, and I just wanted to go back through that list of books and talk about whether I've actually read those books, and if I did, whether I liked them as much as I was expecting to. I'll link the original TBR video down below for reference, but I've tried to recreate the atmosphere of that video. For some reason, I decided to wear the same outfit again for continuity, and I'm filming in the same location as well, which happens to be sitting on the floor in a corner, which is a poor decision because now I'm a year older. I'm like an old lady, and sitting down on the floor is not as easy as it used to be. So let's get into the list of books. Starting off with some good news, I mentioned that I had set my Goodreads challenge at 75 books for 2018, which is a bit on the low side for me, even though it's still a very respectable number. But I thought I was trying to be kind to myself. I knew that it was my first year of full-time teaching, and I didn't want to cause any more stress in my life. So I'm happy to report back, by the end of the year, I've actually doubled that reading goal, and I ended up making it to 150 books, which is actually a new all-time record for me. So that is pretty cool to see. The first list of books that I talked about were 10 classics that I wanted to read this year, so let's go through them and see how I did. The first book on my list was the Poetic Edda. I was looking to get into Norse mythology, and I did read this one pretty early on into the year. I finished this in January and went on to read at least 3 other books about Norse mythology, so this one was a big success. The next book was Beowulf, and this is my first miss of the video. Did not get to Beowulf. Still want to, just it never really happened. The next book was Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. I did read this one in the summer, and it was so much weirder than I was expecting it to be. So I have kind of mixed feelings about this book because it could be like really dry and boring at times, but there were so many like unexpected, delightfully insane moments in this book that I kind of liked it at the same time. The next book was Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. I did read this one as well, and this is one that I didn't appreciate as much as I thought I was going to. I knew that this was going to be satirical, but I didn't find the satire that funny. So I could like appreciate it on an intellectual level, but like I just didn't have a good time while reading this book, essentially. Even though you got to appreciate a man who's going to roast England. So I'm still glad that I gave it a try. Another British author that I wanted to try in 2018 was Jane Austen. On my list, I put Northanger Abbey because that was the only one of her books that I owned. So I didn't read this one, but I did end up reading the big fan favorite, Pride and Prejudice. So I will still give myself a point for this one because really I just wanted to read Jane Austen. So Pride and Prejudice was more fun than I was expecting. Like I mentioned in my TBR video, I tried to read this one in high school and I absolutely hated it, but I'm, I guess, a much more mature person. I could appreciate this book for what it was, and I did quite enjoy myself reading this, and I'm looking forward to reading more by Jane Austen in the future. Another female British novelist I wanted to read this year was Elizabeth Gaskell, and I did read North and South in February of this year, and I thought it was quite delightful, and I do appreciate how she was trying to bring social issues of the time into her fiction. Then I wanted to read The Fortune of the Rougon by Émile Zola. I did just scrape through with this one in December and absolutely loved this book. I'm now so excited for the Rougon-Macquart series. I'm so happy that I got to this one. For Russian classics this year, I said that I wanted to read Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev, which I did. I read this book over a weekend. It's very short, and I just have fond memories of just like spending that one weekend really immersed into this book. It was more emotional than I thought that it was going to be, and my biggest surprise with this book was that I connected to the father-parent characters more than the rebellious sons, so that was like unexpected, and I feel like I realized that I was an adult reading this book. And the other Russian classic that I wanted to read was One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I did read this one, and I enjoyed it really about as much as you can enjoy a book about a guy stuck in a Siberian prison camp, so glad I gave this one a go. And the last book on my classics list was The Maias. This was kind of a big Portuguese classic, and unfortunately I did not get to this one this year. Even though I'm still very excited about reading this, there was just never really a time that I felt was the right moment, so did not get to this one in 2018. In total, I read 8 out of the 10 classics on my list, which I'm pretty happy about since I did read some other classics that I didn't put on my list in January, such as this one, Metamorphoses by Ovid. This is a book I've wanted to read forever, but I was actually too scared to commit to reading this by putting it on my TBR list, and I did manage to read this one over the summer. So there were lots of good classics that I got to that weren't on that TBR list. Moving on to my list of 10 more contemporary books, the book that I was most excited about reading this year was Wizard of the Crow by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I was a bit nervous about this one since it has been compared to so many of my favorite books. I didn't really think that it could live up to my expectations, but I'm happy to report back that it really did. This was just such a great book. It's so long, but it's such an easy and fun read. It's so captivating. It has this folktale quality, and yet it also is a hilarious takedown of African dictatorships, so I adored this book. The next one on my list was Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector. I'd never read any of her novels, and I really wanted to fix that this year, and I did end up reading this one, and I did enjoy it. It was so weird, but I'm so captivated by her writing style. She's really not like anyone else. And the main character from this book, Joanna, is one of the most fascinating female characters that I've ever read about. So I did really love this one. Then next on my list was Blood and Guts in High School by Kathy Acker. I did end up reading this one. I knew going into it that it was going to be very strange, but I yet still somehow wasn't prepared for how weird and disturbing this one ended up being. I thought in my TBR video I mentioned that I'm either gonna love it or hate it, and I don't think that my reaction was that extreme. It was just like, this is kind of too much for me, but at the same time, I appreciate what Acker is trying to do, so this was just a wild ride. I also wanted to read this bind-up of 3 novels by Samuel Beckett, and I swear, this is like my curse in life. I have had this book for at least 4 years, and I have fully intended on reading it each of those 4 years, and it just never happens for me. I feel like I will never be able to read this book, and the thing is, like, I tried. I think there were at least 4 times this year where I picked it up with the intention of reading it, started reading it, and then just did not continue. Maybe it's like the writing style, I don't know if you can see, but it's one of those real like wall of text kind of books where it's just like paragraphs for days, and that's just not easy for me. Just looking at a page like that is kind of stressful, so I don't know, I haven't been in the right place for this. So once again, I failed at reading this book. I'm going to stop putting it on my TBR lists, though I am going to keep trying. I think it's a Samuel Beckett line where he says, I can't go on, I'll go on, and that's kind of how I feel about reading some of his books. The next author on my list was Louise Erdrich, and I put her book Love Medicine on my list since that was the only one of her books that I owned back in January. I didn't read this one, but I did end up picking up The Roundhouse, which I guess I was just a bit more drawn to this cover with this ominous bloody feather. And I did really enjoy this book. It was a great introduction to her work. This is a story about a crime that happens on a reservation and a boy who has to figure out what happened and what he wants to do about it. And I just did really enjoy this book, and I know Louise Erdrich is an author that I will continue to read a lot more in the future, especially since used bookstores always seem to be like teeming with copies of her books. So I already have a pretty good mini collection going on. Next on the list is Stoner by John Williams. If you've seen my recent December wrap-up, then you know that I absolutely loved reading this book. I put it off all until the end of the year. When you look at the cover, you'd think that it's going to be kind of like a very dry and serious novel, so I just was not expecting for it to be such an emotional reading experience. I got very invested in this novel, and I just absolutely loved it. The next book is Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee. I did read this one. I did not love this one. I have very mixed feelings about it, but I don't think that it was a positive reading experience overall, so this one was definitely a disappointment for me. Then I have The Slinks by Tatiana Tolstaya, and oh man, I was expecting to like this book, but I loved this book. I loved it so much. It was so strange. It's about this like future post-apocalyptic Russian society, and dystopians are like usually not my thing, but this was just like so strange. I got so invested in this story, and it was also like just super weird and funny and dark, and I absolutely loved this book. Definitely one of my highlights from this year. Next on the list was Dunbar by Edward St. Aubyn. This is in the Hogarth Shakespeare series, which provides modern retellings of Shakespearean plays, and I did not get to this book this year because I figured that I would have to reread King Lear before reading this play, and King Lear is an ordeal. You know, it's not a casual Shakespeare play, but I'm hoping to do that at some point so that I can fully appreciate what Edward St. Aubyn does in Dunbar. However, I am still going to give myself half a point because I ended up reading Hagseed by Margaret Atwood, and this is also a book in the Hogarth Shakespeare series, so I'll give myself half a point for still starting up this series. And this was just so lovely. This is a really delightful, fast-paced, fun retelling of The Tempest, and I just enjoyed this book so much. So this was a really great introduction to the Hogarth Shakespeare series, and hopefully I'll pick up Dunbar next year. And the last book on my list was There But For The by Ali Smith. I did not end up reading this book, but I will still give myself the point for this one because I ended up reading 2 other Ali Smith novels, and my goal was really just to read more by this author since I had only read one of her books before and I was kind of on the fence about it. So this year I actually ended up reading Autumn and Winter, the first 2 books in her seasonal quartet. I knew that I wanted to read these at some point, but then when I found Autumn at the used bookstore, that was kind of the push that I needed to get started, and I've just enjoyed both of these quite a lot, actually. I just finished Winter just a few days ago, and I'm still like sitting and thinking about it, and I think that they're both like really fun, fast-paced reads that are touching on some interesting contemporary topics. So I'm excited to see where Ali Smith ends up going with this series of books, but in the meantime I do hope to return to some of her backlist books that I didn't get around to this year. In total, I read 8.5 out of the 10 contemporary novels that I wanted to read this year, with my big failure being these pesky 3 novels by Samuel Beckett, which just haunt me every year. Now we're going to move into my list of 5 short stories that I wanted to read. The first collection is What We Talk About When We Talk About Love by Raymond Carver. This was also on my 2017 TBR, and I don't know what my excuse was for not reading it that year, because it's like pretty slim, but I did finally read this year in November, and I loved it so much. It was so dark and so sad, but I just really loved these short stories. Will definitely need more Raymond Carver in my life. The next one was The Doll's Alphabet by Camilla Grudova. I did read this one pretty early on in the year, in January, I think, and absolutely loved this batch of short stories. These were just so weird, so strange. They're set in this world that is like somehow like Victorian and familiar, but like completely like nothing that you've really ever seen before. So I just loved the mood of these stories and the setting. So Camilla Grudova was one of my most exciting author discoveries of the year, especially after I learned that she's Canadian. The next collection was Things We Lost in the Fire, which was by Mariana Enriquez, who's an Argentinian author, I believe. And yeah, I read this one as well. And these stories, they were just as creepy and unsettling as I thought that they were going to be. I actually was reading one of them late at night, and my bookshelf broke and created this big crash sound right while I was reading something really scary in this collection, and I like thought that I was going to have a heart attack and die. So yeah, these were definitely creepy, and I need more by this author. The next collection was The World Goes On by Laszlo Krasnohorkai. There was motivation to read this book, especially since it made it on the shortlist, I think, for the Man Booker International Prize, but I did start this one. As you can see, I made it a good 28 pages into it, and it wasn't going well for me. I really didn't like the style of these stories or the voice or what they were doing or like the long sentences. So I did stop reading this one. In my mind, I'm going to return back to it and give it another chance, but I did not love how this collection started off, so I do not get the point for this one because I didn't finish it. Also, I've somehow wasted. My best bookmark has just been sitting in this book for like 10 months. My cool skull keep out bookmark. So I'm actually going to take this one out of the book and start using this bad boy again. And lastly, I wanted to reread the collected stories of Lydia Davis. Now, I did not finish rereading this whole book. I did make a good start of it. I probably got through the first short story collection in here, and I'm not sure why I didn't finish, to be honest. I was enjoying myself. Lydia Davis's stories are very fun and refreshing, and I quite enjoy them. So I don't know why I stopped rereading this one, but that's okay. I will give myself 0.25 points for at least trying with this one. My final score for short stories was 3.5 out of 5. I started each of these collections, but I just didn't finish all of them. But that's okay because the 3 that I did read the whole way through were all really amazing. So now we're going to move on to our last list, and that was 5 nonfiction books that I wanted to read. The first one was The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I did read this one during Nonfiction November. It was definitely a very sobering, heavy read about the criminal justice system in America, but I wasn't quite as blown away by this book as I was expecting to be after hearing so many glowing reviews about this book, just because I thought that it was like a very biased text and I didn't always trust the information in here, but it definitely gave me a lot to think about, so I'm still really glad that I picked it up for sure. Next on my list was The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This was a bit of a sneaky TBR pick because I didn't realize that this essay is really only like 60 pages or something. It's actually very short. So yes, this was a very manageable pick, and I did read this one as well in Nonfiction November. And like always with James Baldwin, it was an incredible experience. He is just such a beautiful writer. He makes you think so much. He makes you feel so much. I'm just always impressed when I walk away from a Baldwin book. Next on my list was Stolen Continents by Ronald Wright. I did not read this one. Don't really have an excuse for it, just didn't end up happening. The next book is The Land We Are. Artists and Writers Unsettle the Politics of Reconciliation. I did read this book, also in Nonfiction November, and I really did love this book. It was so cool. It is a collection of like essays and photos, and it's all about the artistic process and collaboration and how the reconciliation movement in Canada is not as genuine as it might appear. So there were a lot of critical points made in this text, but it was also very positive about how like art can inspire change in people and whatnot. So this was a really cool book. Very glad that I gave this one a chance. And the last book on my list was the book that I was the most intimidated about reading, and that was The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. Now this was a book that was also on my 2017 TBR, and I did not go anywhere near this in 2017, but I did finally make it through this one in 2018, which I'm very happy about because this is just such a cool book that really changes the way that you see the world and gender dynamics, and it was just a very fascinating read. And this was my first Simone de Beauvoir, and I'm low-key obsessed with her now, so I anticipate that I will be reading more of her works in 2019 for sure. So in total, I read 4 out of the 5 nonfiction books that I wanted to read, and I think it's pretty hilarious that I did complete reading all of those books in Nonfiction November. So I'm glad that that readathon happens in that month, or this section would have been a pretty poor showing. So I have put all the final results together, and out of 30, it looks like I have read 23.75 of the books that I wanted to read this year. Putting that into a percentage, that is a 79%. And as a teacher, I really don't believe in giving marks that end with a 9. Of course, you're going to round up. So I will round that up to an 80%. So that is pretty good. Where I teach, an 80% means that you've exceeded expectations. So that is a grade that I'm pretty happy with. I don't know why I'm turning this into like a marking and a grading thing. I'm on my vacation. That is like the last thing that I want to be doing. So I'm going to stop with the numbers. But yeah, overall, I did a pretty good job of making it through this this list. I'm not a person that usually sticks to a plan, so I'm pretty happy that I showed some discipline this year and made it through a lot of the books that I was excited to read about at the start of the year. Thanks for watching this update video. I'm going to go close my blinds because I think there is actually sunlight coming through my window right now, which I haven't seen in a while, I feel like, and I'm not used to it. I've gone full vampire over these past few days, so I can't deal with it. So I'm gonna go seal myself back up in my darkness. This is a weird way to end a video, but I'm gonna stick with it. So yeah, see you again some other time. Bye!